When talking about a topic like this, I really think you have to be careful to straddle the line of not being a gatekeeper. I think that's often very toxic itself and ridiculous. But I wanted to talk about the Final Fantasy VII fandom. With Final Fantasy, you have different games, different styles. People like different ones. Some people like all of them, and that's cool. But with Final Fantasy VII in particular, there is a subset of fans that are extremely obsessive about the game. And it's not healthy. It's not a good way to behave. I would say it's very dangerous. It's led to a lot of bad behaviors over the years. It's led to voice actors, producers, all kinds of people involved with the games weighing in and offering their opinion on it, which is not a great thing to be attracting. Like, you're so loud and obnoxious that even these people are seeing it. And that's that shipping fandom. Now, if you're wondering what is shipping, like, is this when I order something online and it gets sent to my house? No, this is essentially the idea of pairing two characters together. And someone might look at that and say, oh, this is stupid. Well, everybody has something like shipping to some extent if you care about a story. Like, you read a story or you watch a story, you play a story, and you say, oh, I really like this relationship between these two characters. Sometimes it's a friendship. Sometimes it's familial, sometimes it's romantic, you know? And shipping usually is focusing a lot more when we're talking about it here on the romantic side. When it comes to Final Fantasy VII in particular, there are a lot of people who are only fans of Final Fantasy VII, and then within that group, there's a lot of people who are very, very obsessive about the relationships within the game, almost to a parasocial extent. This has led to a lot of mistreatment within the fandom, from doxing to threats to just general stupidity. I wish that I could go through and show a lot of the Twitter stuff, but now with how YouTube works and the revised rules from a few years ago, you have to be really careful with stuff like that because of dogpiling and harassment and stuff like that. They think that you showing these examples is encouraging someone to go attack faceless weirdo 32 on Twitter. It's not. But if you go on Twitter and you look up the, interactions between these people, or you go to Reddit, you look at the interactions between these people who think Cloud, the title character, belongs with Aerith, or Cloud belongs with Tifa. A lot of it is very vitriolic. A lot of it is fighting. It's not well-reasoned debate. It's not civil conversation. And it's not passion. It's parasocial, honestly borderline psychotic behavior from people that I actually think in many cases need professional help. Now, does that mean that everybody who's interested in these relationships and in this story falls in that category? They all need help. Get a life, go touch grass. I can't believe you care about this story. No, absolutely not. I made a video talking about this before. This is a game that changed my life. Now, does that mean that I am more of a fan, or that my opinion matters more than someone who maybe found the series through Final Fantasy VII Remake and they're enjoying it? No. Somebody could have gotten into this a year ago, my cat agreed in the background, and they're just as big of a fan as I am from, 15 years ago. That's okay. But I do think that in general, people, there's too many people who've been unhealthy with this. So I want to take a look at this for a few minutes today. It was brought to my attention when Brianna White, the voice actress around Aerith, even felt the need to comment on it because people were being so mean. And I think it's just sad, especially from a series of games and a game in particular that really, really was there for me when I was a kid, when I was a very lonely kid and really interested in narratives like this. So I do have a question of the day for you, which is, what is the worst fandom experience you've had? I would say, what's the worst fandom? But I feel like people would be generic with that. I genuinely want to know, what is like the worst experience detailed in the comments that you have had interacting with fans of something? It could be Star Wars, Final Fantasy, Game of Thrones. I don't care what it is, but what happened and why did it go that way? Because I think it's unfortunate the way people treat these things. So like I said, there's a lot of mistreatment between fans around this franchise, which is sad because in many ways this franchise and this game in particular is a story that should bring people together, a story about love and being human, something we'll talk about in a minute. But instead of that happening, for some of these people, it's become things like doxing. It's become things like personal threats. It's become things like going after people's family members online, or trying to ruin someone's reputation, making up allegations about people, just kind of flying off the handle because you are so attached to that thing that you view this fan who views the story differently as opposition in a war when it's not actually that deep. And it's funny to me, I have a literal degree in storytelling. Like, I have a communication arts and literature degree. I went to school for interpreting literature. I went to school for writing. I went to college for these things. Now, does that make me smarter than other people? No. There's probably plenty of people who are a plumber or a janitor who could write circles around me. They're an amazing creative writer, and that's great. But my point is that even for me, someone who's so passionate about this, I was willing to go into debt to go to school around these topics. I understand where the boundaries are. I understand where it becomes unhealthy, and I understand where it becomes parasocial, and where it becomes something where I have to take a step back and say, I like this thing, I am passionate about this thing, but also this is not my thing only. This is not something I made. This is not my franchise. Do these franchises in a way belong to the fans in general too? Legally, no, but I would say colloquially, yes. You know, where Star Wars matters because people care about it just as much as it matters because of the author and what they made. And I feel the same way for something like Final Fantasy. You know, Final Fantasy would still matter if it was an amazing script sitting in someone's drawer that never made. That's still a piece of art from a human being, and it has value to me because of that. But I also think that a bunch of the value comes from how passionate people are about it, how much they love it, and what they get out of it. This, to me, is where I think all of the schools of thought around literary interpretation should matter. Now, there are more than these three, but three of the main ones that we look at in literature are the author's intent, what the text or media says, whether that's a written work or it is a game or movie, and then, of course, as well, the audience response. I personally believe all of these need to matter. Without the author intent, the story can mean absolutely anything to anybody. It's almost postmodernism unchecked. I could write a story about how stealing is bad, and you could read it and say the story is about how grapes are your favorite fruit. It doesn't make any sense. When you have no author intent and no text or media interpretation of what's there, the work is worthless. And this is something that T.S. Eliot talked about a lot in stories like The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, talked a lot about in stories like The Wasteland as well, in postmodern literature, especially following World War I, was where he was talking about the ideas of not being able to communicate your thoughts because you can never fully let someone else know your truth. You can never fully convey what you mean because you and that person are from different walks of life. When you get to that unchecked, it becomes very, very doom and gloom. It becomes very, very, there's no point to interact with other fans or other people in the world at all because they will never have your exact experience. They will never fully understand you. There's no point. You might as well isolate yourself or view things narcissistically on the other end of that spectrum because none of those people matter because your experience is superior. And that's the way I genuinely think a lot of people act, is that version of it. My experience is superior. My way of thinking is the only way. The authors, they don't matter unless it backs up my interpretation. The text, it doesn't matter unless it backs up my interpretation. But meanwhile, without that interpretation, without audience response, art loses a lot of its point. If no one wants to talk about it, if no one wants to be passionate about it, if no one wants to discuss and debate, write fan fiction, do fan cosplays, do fan art, media dies because then you have no fandom. You have nothing around that thing. It has no lasting cultural impact and it doesn't really matter. It was just thrown out into the void and it didn't land with anyone. So in that way, it still matters, not just because of consumption and floating the art and paying the bills of the artist, but because that response does give a lot of value as well to it. What I think is unfortunate about this fandom topic with shipping is that these people who want Cloud with Aerith, or these people who want Tifa with Cloud, or any of these things, a lot of them aren't looking at it from that aspect. They're looking at it from the way that I think Brianna White described very well, which is this idea of your way is the only way. She's talked about this a few times in different things. Once she was speaking to arch rival of the channel CBR. That's an old joke from the Degenerate J channel if you've followed for that long. But when an interview basically came up about this, an interview topic, She said, maybe it's just my point of view. I'm generally a liker of things. I'm generally not the kind of person who would say, oh, my way is the only correct way. And I think a lot of people get into these arguments because they have not seen the other side of things. I think they should. I love that people are passionate about the characters, and I really don't care if one person has a preference for one ship over another, but I do encourage them to be nice about it. If you think your way is the only way, that's incorrect. If you're going to be mean about it, that's also incorrect. That's just wrong. So I try to stay out of it as much as possible, but I do insert myself just enough to say, hey, be nice. And she spoke about this recently again on Twitter, saying, by the way, Brianna White is one of like the most beautiful women I've ever seen. If you've ever seen her cosplay of Aerith, it's breathtaking. This woman is like a smoke show. But she's also very smart. And she was talking about this and said, when my sibling and I would fight as kids, my mom would tell us to touch noses until we inevitably started giggling and got over it. I say this with love. FF7 shippers need to touch noses. We're all the same family in loving these characters, so relax. And that's kind of where I fall on this too, is that I feel like people have overattached themselves to the point where it's not just that they're passionate, it's that they are genuinely angry and ready to jump on any tiny little thing as proof of their point of view. Now, recently, I know that there was a weigh-in about this, and I don't remember exactly who said it. You can point out in the comments down below, but they described Aerith's love for Cloud as more sisterly, and the internet jumped on that. A lot of people who didn't want Cloud to be with Aerith, and they said, well, see, it's a sisterly thing. And for me, it's very complicated because that word, the way it was described in Japanese, doesn't even mean what it means in English. But a lot of people were so ready to jump on that, like the idea of oni-chan. That means something different in Japanese when you look at that idea of like, you know, that kind of familial relation. It can still be between a romantic partner. I mean, you see that all the time in anime. But a lot of people wanted to jump on this small nugget because they said it supports my idea. And this fan argument and war reignited over that online on Reddit, Twitter, and other places. I'm sure your grandma's Facebook chat probably got hit with someone being a crazy psycho about it. But instead of talking about it kindly, just a lot of people went off the handle about it. They flew completely out of bounds and decided to turn it into something personal. And this is where I think it's interesting because you can get into all the spoilers of the story, something I was trying not to do heavily here. But with minor spoilers, I will say this. There are examples in the text, in the original Final Fantasy VII, and in Remake and Rebirth, that leave things open to your interpretation of, if things went a certain way, would Cloud end up with Aerith? If Cloud ended up with Aerith, is it because of him or because of events that happened to him? Is it both? Was Cloud destined to be with Tifa? Was he not? How much free will is there? I mean, that's something that a big point of Final Fantasy VII Remake's ending and Rebirth in general is about, free will versus fate. And when you get into these things, I think there are examples that can be made and pointed to for either interpretation. I personally believe that Cloud loves both of these women in different ways. And I think that you can love more than one person at once. Some people disagree. I think you can. But at the end of the day, there are going to be people who say, well, then you have to choose between these people. And that's a fair argument too, right? Like you could fall in love. I mean, how many movies, stories have been about someone falling in love with two people and then they have to choose. Who will it be? And that's a fair point too. That's drama. That's story. It's juicy. It's something humans long for in their storytelling. And that's okay too. And I think it's interesting how people aren't willing to have these discussions about it, but instead are willing to fight about it. To me, I think this comes back to treating being a fan of something like a religion. But what's weird about it is that we've seen in history what happens when people treat religion like this. You know, when they're so vehement about it, they're so extreme about it that they're willing to hurt people. We see that and we point at it and we say that was bad. But then people are willing to do it now with fandoms, with stories and myth in the modern day, because they don't have that religion. You know, like they've found a new thing to fill that hole in them. They found a new thing. They're also thinking way too much about filling holes when it comes to shipping, but they found a new thing to fill that gap in them. And so they've decided to make that their religion. It's like their whole personality is, I'm a fan of Tifa and Aerith sleeping together. I'm not, like that's my whole personality. These two fictional characters. It's not just an interest. It's not something fun. It's not something enjoyable to you to talk about with your friends. It's your whole personhood. And I think when your whole personhood lies in one thing like that, it's always been pointed to as bad. What's interesting to me is a lot of the people who do this, they could point to examples of this and say that was bad. They could point to examples of ultra nationalism. They could point to examples in history of religious fanaticism. They could point to examples of sports fans. Have you ever seen what happens after like a huge game? After things like the playoffs, things like that. Some cities, there's riots. People die. People get beaten up. And, people can point at that and be like, why does this matter? You're not on the team. That's not your son out there playing. Why are you so angry? And I think a lot of these people, if you sat them down in a room, they could point to that and see that that's an example of what we're talking about. But then they do it with this. And that's what's so weird to me. My wife, Jill, I wanted her in this video at first, but she was not feeling too good tonight. And she wrote down some of her points that I really agree with. She talked about this story, and I completely agree with her that this, in a lot of ways, is a story about love and being human and the dangers of losing your humanity as well. In many ways, when you look at this story in broad strokes, Cloud is opening up more over the story, over the entire Final Fantasy VII mythos, whether you're looking at the old games or the new. And he's becoming more human. He's accepting himself for who he is. He doesn't need to pretend to be cool all the time. He's letting others in. And no matter where you feel on this argument, part of that is because of both the actions of Aerith and Tifa in his life at different points. Part of that is his friends, people reaching out to him, people willing to see that humanity in him regardless of his cold exterior. And he begins to value the world more because of it. The villain of this game, or one of the primary villains, Sephiroth, is the opposite. He becomes less human due to tragedies and traumas in his own life, and he begins to hate the world more and more. And I find it interesting that people don't view this story through that lens. Like, they might understand it in a broad stroke, but they're behaving in a way that tells me that the story hasn't actually influenced them. It hasn't actually connected with them. I see this all the time with characters where people will act like they idolize a character. They'll say this person's so amazing, but then they behave and act in a way that's antithetical to the character, to the point where if you met that character in real life and they did exist, they would think you were nuts. And for me, that's not how I want to be. When I see a character like Cloud, I try and take lessons that he learns in his life, and I say, how does this apply to mine? I don't take it and say, how can I hurt people with this and beat them over the head with this text like a cudgel? And that's where I think it's very, very unhealthy. I also find it a little unfortunate that at the end of the day, a lot of people who get into these arguments are only fans of Final Fantasy VII. Now, that's not saying these arguments don't happen in other fandoms. They do. Like the Twilight fandom back in the day, insanity. People were crazy about it. Bella belongs with Edward. No, Bella belongs with Jacob. Well, my fan fiction shows Jacob and Edward together. And people would get very vehemently angry about this. Now, it wasn't when the internet was as big, so you didn't see as many examples of it, but it did happen. So this does happen in other fandoms and has happened at other times, but what's weird to me about Final Fantasy is that I don't see this as much with any other Final Fantasy game. And to me, when I see a lot of people who are into 7 and I ask them about other games, they've never played any of them. They've never experienced any of them. Now, does that mean they're not a fan of Final Fantasy? I guess I would say they're more a fan of just Final Fantasy VII, which is fine, but they don't have that broader scope or that experience with the franchise where they can enjoy these types of stories, have opinions on other ones, and talk to people in a healthy way about them. They are just so hyper-focused and fixated on this one version of the title that they don't have anything else. I guess I'm interested to hear what you think in the comments down below. For me, when you have an absolute sweetheart like Brianna White who has to get involved and tell people to chill out, it's just sad, because to me that kind of shows that it's gone a little too far. I think that these things should matter. Passion should matter. Audience response and interpretation should matter. I even think creators should take those things into account when making your stories. Not that, ad populum or the idea of everyone says one thing so it's right is true, but it's worth examining if 90% of your audience hated your game or your movie, what didn't connect with people? What was going on there? Was there a problem? Those things are worth looking at. Tetsuya Nomura has done a great example of that with Kingdom Hearts, where he's taken characters that people say, I wish they did more with this, and he does more with them because he values the fans. I think the fans do matter, but when the fans become almost warriors in a proxy war against each other that doesn't matter, I think it's become unhealthy. And I think that if you can't separate yourself from that kind of thing, it becomes not passion, it becomes obsession. And I think at that point, people either need to take a step back or genuinely ask themselves, do I need maybe a little bit of help? Do I need to actually see somebody about this? There's a reason people go to psychiatrists and mental health professionals for things like this when they have a hyperfixation on something or someone that becomes unhealthy. Sometimes it does need to be treated. And I think that if people can't pull themselves away from that, it is something that might be worth looking inward about. If you enjoyed this video, you want to leave a like, subscribe, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I appreciate that very, very much. We have a lot of ways to support this channel and other channels, which will be in the top comment and also in the description. And finally, we do have our own store, cosmobunny.shop, where we make things out of recycled, repurposed comic book, manga, and magazine paper. These are from magazines and comic books that were being thrown out or discounted dirt cheap because they are damaged. And what we do is we take those, we turn them into new transformative art. My wife Jill runs this business, does a great job, and we recycle the rest of the paper. So we hope you enjoyed this video. Have a fantastic day. As always, everyone, stay shui.